The sea churned violently as the lone kamikaze aircraft streaked toward the USS KIDD, trailing smoke and fire in its wake. The date was April 11th, 1945, and the skies above Okinawa had become a slaughterhouse of metal and flesh. Radar operator Second Class Thomas Reynolds gripped the console tightly, his knuckles white as bone. He had just watched 3 aerial raids repelled by their destroyer squadron, but this fourth attack was different. A single plane had broken through, initially aiming for the USS Black before suddenly changing course. Now it was heading straight for them. "All hands! Brace for impact!" The warning barely registered before the deafening explosion rocked the Fletcher-class destroyer. The kamikaze slammed into the KIDD's starboard side just below the main deck, tearing through the forward boiler room like a demonic spear. Shrapnel and scalding steam erupted in all directions as the plane's bomb penetrated the hull and detonated. In that instant, 38 men were killed and 55 more were wounded, nearly 1/3 of her crew. As seawater flooded in through the gaping wound, shipfitter First Class Russell Keith knew they had mere minutes before the KIDD would join the growing list of American destroyers claimed by the waters off Okinawa. The 34-year-old from Bath, Maine, lunged toward the damage control station, his mind racing. The destroyer's very survival hung by a thread. But what Keith and his damage control team would do in the next 17 minutes wouldn't just save a ship. It would reveal the crucial difference between survival and catastrophic destruction that had claimed the mightiest battleship ever built, the Japanese Yamato, just 4 days earlier. No one aboard the KIDD that morning realized that their response to disaster would expose a fundamental truth about modern naval warfare, one that would rewrite the very doctrine of naval combat survival for generations to come. Russell Keith had never planned on becoming a sailor, let alone a shipfitter responsible for keeping a warship afloat during battle. Born in 1911 in the coastal shipbuilding town of Bath, Maine, Keith had grown up watching massive vessels take shape in the famous Bath Iron Works. His father, a steelworker who helped build destroyers during the First World War, had taught him the fundamentals of metallurgy and welding before he had learned to drive. "My old man always said a good shipfitter is worth 10 sailors when the hull's breached," Keith would later recall in an interview with naval historians. He'd seen good ships go down because nobody knew how to stop the flooding. I took that to heart. After graduating high school in 1929, Keith joined Bath Iron Works as an apprentice, learning the intricate art of shaping and fitting steel plates to a ship's hull. When the Great Depression hit, Keith was one of the few workers retained, his skills deemed essential for the limited military contracts that kept the shipyard afloat. During these lean years, he mastered advanced welding techniques and developed innovative methods for emergency repairs, skills that would later prove invaluable. By 1940, with war looming on the horizon, Bath Iron Works had received contracts to build several of the new Fletcher-class destroyers. Keith worked on many of them, including the USS Urban, the USS Stemble, and ironically, the USS KIDD herself. "I knew every inch of those hulls," he would later say. "I helped build their skeletons, knew their strengths and their weaknesses." When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Keith was 30 years old, older than most recruits. But his expertise was too valuable to remain in the civilian sector. He enlisted in the Navy in 1943, and in one of those strange twists of fate that often accompany wartime, was assigned to the USS KIDD, a ship he had helped construct. "It felt like coming home," he once said, "except now I was responsible for keeping her together when the enemy tried to blow her apart." Keith quickly gained the respect of the KIDD's officers, including Commander Fred Bush, who recognized his exceptional abilities in damage control. By 1944, he had been promoted to shipfitter first class and placed in charge of one of the destroyer's damage control teams. His men called him the Patcher for his almost supernatural ability to seal breaches in the hull under the most harrowing conditions. The KIDD's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander William Roberts, once wrote in his personal log, If this ship ever takes a serious hit, Keith is the man who will make the difference between survival and sinking. I've never seen anyone who understands the structural integrity of a destroyer better than he does. As the KIDD sailed into the increasingly dangerous waters of the Western Pacific in early 1945, that assessment would be put to the ultimate test. What no one aboard realized was that the knowledge contained in Keith's head, knowledge born in the shipyards of Maine, would soon confront the same destructive force that had just annihilated the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Meanwhile, 4 days earlier and 200 miles north of Okinawa, the largest battleship ever built was meeting a very different fate. The Yamato, pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, displaced 70,000 tons, more than 3 times the size of the USS KIDD. Her 9 18-inch guns were the largest ever mounted on a warship, capable of hurling shells weighing as much as a small car over 25 miles. She represented the pinnacle of battleship design, the embodiment of naval power in steel form. Yet, on April 7, 1945, the mighty Yamato was steaming toward Okinawa on what amounted to a suicide mission. Operation Tengo, as the Japanese had designated it, was a desperate gambit, with fuel reserves so depleted that the battleship carried only enough for a one-way trip. The plan called for Yamato to fight her way to Okinawa, beach herself, and then use her massive guns as shore batteries until destroyed. It was a mission born of desperation and Emperor Hirohito's pointed question to his naval staff. But what about the Navy? What are they doing to assist in defending Okinawa? Have we no more ships? As Yamato and her small escort of 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers steamed south from Japan, American intelligence had already detected their movement. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, ordered a massive strike force of 386 carrier aircraft to intercept the Japanese force. At 12:37 in the afternoon, the first American aircraft spotted Yamato. Wave after wave of torpedo bombers and dive bombers swarmed the massive battleship. Despite valiant anti-aircraft fire from Yamato and her escorts, the outcome was never in doubt. By 2:23 in the afternoon, after sustaining hits from at least 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs, Yamato capsized and exploded with such force that the mushroom cloud could be seen over 100 miles away. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors perished with her. In just under 2 hours, the mightiest battleship ever constructed had been reduced to a tomb on the ocean floor. The cause wasn't just American air power, it was the fundamental vulnerability that massive capital ships like Yamato faced in the new age of aerial warfare. Without adequate damage control systems and compartmentalization, even the mightiest vessels could be overwhelmed by water flooding into torpedo-inflicted wounds. This was the same threat now facing the USS KIDD just 4 days later, but with one crucial difference. The Americans had learned lessons about survival that the Japanese had not. The Fletcher-class destroyer program represented the backbone of American naval power in the Pacific. With 175 ships built between 1942 and 1944, they were the most numerous destroyer class produced during World War II. Designed to be fast, maneuverable, and heavily armed, the Fletchers carried 5 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, and an array of anti-aircraft weapons. But their most important feature wasn't offensive, it was defensive. The designers at Gibbs and Cox had incorporated advanced damage control features that would prove crucial in the Pacific campaign. The Fletchers featured extensive compartmentalization, with watertight bulkheads dividing the ship into sections that could be isolated in case of flooding. Their fire suppression systems included multiple, independent pumping stations. And, most importantly, they were designed with enough reserve buoyancy to survive significant flooding. USS KIDD DD-661 was commissioned on April 23, 1943, named after Rear Admiral Isaac C. Kidd, who had died on the bridge of his flagship USS Arizona during the attack on Pearl Harbor. From the beginning, she stood out among her sister ships. During her initial cruise to the Brooklyn naval shipyards, She sailed across New York Harbor with the Jolly Roger flying from her foremast, earning her the nickname the Pirate of the Pacific. The KIDD's crew had developed a fierce pride in their ship, none more so than Russell Keith and his damage control teams. They drilled relentlessly, practicing for every conceivable emergency. Keith had instituted his own unique training regimen based on his knowledge of the Fletcher-class hull design. Most damage control teams practice by the book, recalled Seaman Robert Collins, who served under Keith. But Keith made us practice in the dark, underwater, with the ship rocking. He'd say, "The enemy doesn't wait for perfect conditions, so neither do we." By April 1945, the KIDD was serving as part of Task Force 58, supporting the invasion of Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The battle had begun on April 1st, and immediately the Japanese had unleashed a new and terrifying weapon, massed kamikaze attacks. These suicide aircraft, loaded with explosives and piloted by young men willing to die for their emperor, were particularly effective against destroyers like the KIDD, which were serving as radar picket ships around Okinawa. The radar picket stations were essentially sacrificial positions. Destroyers were stationed as an early warning system, detecting incoming Japanese aircraft before they could reach the main American fleet. This made them the primary targets for kamikaze attacks. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, the U.S. Navy would lose more ships than in any other battle in its history, with destroyers bearing the brunt of the casualties. On April 11, 1945, the KIDD was on picket duty with her squadron mates Black Bullard and Chauncey. The ships had already fought off 3 separate air raids that morning. The crew was exhausted but vigilant, knowing that more attacks were likely coming. At approximately 1:45 in the afternoon, radar detected another incoming raid. This time, a single Japanese aircraft managed to penetrate the combat air patrol. The plane initially targeted the USS Black, but then suddenly changed course and dove toward the KIDD. Despite intense anti-aircraft fire, the kamikaze crashed into the starboard side of the KIDD, penetrating the hull just below the main deck at the forward boiler room. The plane's bomb passed completely through the ship before detonating, creating catastrophic damage. Steam pipes ruptured, scalding sailors in the boiler room. The impact ruptured fuel lines, igniting fires throughout the forward sections of the ship. And, most dangerously, seawater began flooding in through the gaping wound in the hull. This was the moment when the fate of the KIDD hung in the balance, the same critical juncture that had doomed the mighty Yamato just 4 days earlier. The difference would come down to the actions taken in the next few minutes. The early 1940s marked a revolutionary period in naval warfare. The long-held belief that battleships represented the ultimate naval weapon was being challenged by the rise of carrier aviation. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had demonstrated the vulnerability of capital ships to air attack, but many naval officers on both sides still clung to outdated doctrines. The Imperial Japanese Navy had invested enormous resources in building the Yamato-class battleships, seeing them as the ultimate expression of naval power. Each of these Leviathans displaced over 70,000 tons and carried 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever mounted on a warship. They were designed to outgun any American battleship, with armor so thick it was believed they could withstand anything short of a direct hit from the largest bombs. What the Japanese failed to adequately address, however, was the vulnerability of even these massive ships to underwater damage from torpedoes. While the Yamato had extensive armor plating along her sides, her underwater protection systems were less sophisticated than American designs. More critically, Japanese damage control doctrine and training lagged significantly behind American practices. The United States Navy, learning from British experiences early in the war, had developed a comprehensive approach to damage control. Every American sailor received basic training in firefighting and flooding control. Specialized damage control teams drilled constantly in realistic scenarios. Ships were designed with multiple redundant systems, allowing them to continue fighting even after sustaining significant damage. A key element of American damage control philosophy was decentralization of authority. While Japanese sailors were trained to wait for orders from officers before taking initiative in an emergency, American crews were encouraged to act immediately based on their training. This difference would prove crucial in the chaotic conditions following a major hit. Another fundamental difference was in the approach to compartmentalization. American destroyers like the Fletcher class were designed with numerous watertight compartments that could be quickly sealed to contain flooding. The material condition of the ship, the status of all watertight doors, hatches, and fittings, was maintained at appropriate levels based on the threat situation. In 1944, as kamikaze attacks became increasingly common, the U.S. Navy undertook a systematic program to improve survivability. Lessons learned from each attack were quickly disseminated throughout the fleet, allowing for continuous improvement in damage control procedures. The April 4, 1945 anti-kamikaze program formalized many of these improvements, including modifications to the Fletcher-class destroyer's anti-aircraft armament. By April 1945, American destroyers like the KIDD represented not just fighting vessels, but complex systems designed to absorb punishment and survive. This philosophy of survival would be put to the ultimate test in the waters off Okinawa. The explosion that ripped through the KIDD's hull threw men like rag dolls against bulkheads and equipment. In the forward boiler room, 16 sailors died instantly as superheated steam engulfed them. The blast wave traveled through passageways, knocking men unconscious and starting fires in multiple compartments. In the damage control center, Russell Keith was thrown to the deck, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing the damage control board to steady himself. Red lights were illuminating across the schematic, indicating breaches and fires throughout the forward section of the ship. "Set material condition Zebra," Keith shouted to his team, referring to the highest state of watertight integrity. Throughout the ship, sailors raced to close and dog down every watertight door and hatch, isolating the damaged sections from the rest of the vessel. Commander Fred Bush, who had assumed command of the KIDD just days earlier after her previous captain was wounded, remained remarkably calm on the bridge. "Damage report," he ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. Reports flooded in from throughout the ship. The forward boiler room was completely destroyed. Fires were burning in adjacent compartments. Most critically, the KIDD was taking on water through a 15-foot gash in her starboard side. In the engine room, machinist's mate First Class William Johnson realized that the flooding threatened to reach the ship's electrical systems. If those shorted out, the KIDD would lose power to her pumps, the same fatal cascade of failures that had doomed so many ships before her. Johnson ordered his men to reroute power through the emergency circuits, ensuring that the pumps could continue operating even as water rose around them. Meanwhile, Keith organized his damage control parties into 3 teams. The first would combat the fires that were spreading through the forward compartments. The second would shore up weakened bulkheads to prevent further structural collapse. The third, led by Keith himself, would attempt to seal the massive breach in the hull. "We need welding gear and every sheet of steel we can find," Keith ordered, "and get me those wooden shoring timbers from the forward hold." As his men scrambled to gather the necessary materials, Keith studied the damage control diagrams. The breach was located in one of the most vulnerable areas of the ship, where several critical systems converged. If they couldn't seal it quickly, the progressive flooding would soon reach a tipping point from which there would be no recovery. This was precisely what had happened to the Yamato 4 days earlier. The Japanese battleship had been struck by multiple torpedoes along her port side, flooding critical compartments. While her damage control teams had responded, they lacked both the training and equipment to contain the flooding. As water poured in and the massive ship began to list, her captain had ordered counter-flooding of starboard compartments to try to level the ship. This desperate measure had only hastened her demise, as it reduced her overall reserve buoyancy to critical levels. Keith knew the physics of flooding intimately. Every ton of seawater that entered the KIDD reduced her buoyancy and stability. Once a ship's center of gravity shifted too far due to the weight of the water, capsizing became inevitable. The clock was ticking, not just in minutes, but in tons of seawater. With water already waist-deep in the damaged compartments, Keith and his team donned emergency breathing apparatus and descended into the flooded spaces. The scene was apocalyptic: twisted metal, floating debris, and the bodies of sailors who hadn't survived the initial blast. But Keith forced himself to focus solely on the breach. "We've got maybe 15 minutes before we lose her," he told his team as they waded through the rising water. "Let's make them count." The gash in the hull was worse than he had feared, nearly 15 feet long and 3 feet high, with jagged edges that would make it difficult to seal. Seawater was pouring in with tremendous force, making it nearly impossible to work directly at the breach. Keith made a split-second decision that would later be studied in naval engineering schools. Rather than trying to patch the hole directly, he ordered his men to construct a cofferdam, essentially a box-like structure that would be built around the breach from the inside, creating a sealed chamber that could contain the flooding while allowing them to work in relatively dry conditions. "We need to redirect the water pressure," he explained to his confused team. "Aber babe, bro." Build the dam 3 feet back from the hull breach. Anchor it to the intact frames on either side. As his men began constructing the makeshift cofferdam, Keith sent another team to the deck above to drive support timbers down through the damaged area, creating a framework that would help hold the patch in place against the tremendous pressure of the sea. The work was agonizingly slow and dangerous. Men struggled to hold heavy steel plates in place while others welded in chest-deep water. Twice the partial repairs collapsed under the pressure, forcing them to start again. All the while the KIDD continued to settle lower in the water, her list to starboard increasing ominously. On the bridge, Commander Bush was facing another crisis. Japanese aircraft were still active in the area, and several were circling the damaged KIDD like vultures, looking for an opportunity to finish her off. Bush ordered all available anti-aircraft guns to maintain a protective barrage around the ship, even as he directed the helmsman to steer a zigzag course that would make the destroyer a more difficult target while minimizing stress on the damaged hull. "We're fighting 2 battles here," Bush told his executive officer. "One against the sea coming in, and another against the Japanese trying to put more holes in us." The KIDD's gunners, despite their exhaustion, responded with fierce determination. As one kamikaze dove toward the wounded destroyer, every available gun opened fire, creating a wall of flak that shredded the attacking aircraft. The plane crashed into the sea just 50 yards from the KIDD's port side, close enough that the explosion showered the deck with seawater. Below decks, the battle against flooding continued with equal intensity. Keith's innovative cofferdam approach was beginning to show results. By redirecting the flow of water, they had created a relatively dry workspace around the breach. Now they could begin the painstaking process of welding a steel patch over the hole. The young fellow that was doing the welding didn't have much experience, Keith would later recall. "I asked Commander Bush if I could be relieved so I could go down and help them. When I went down, they were having a great problem getting the arc started so that the plates could be welded. The water was squirting in. I told them to load all the current they could on it so they could strike an arc and nothing would put it out. They kept going over and over the area and finally got it sealed off, caulked it out, and got it bone dry." This moment represented the critical difference between survival and destruction. Unlike the Yamato, where damage control efforts had been hampered by hierarchical command structures and inadequate training, the KIDD benefited from having a specialist like Keith who could adapt conventional techniques to the specific emergency at hand. His intimate knowledge of the Fletcher-class hull design, combined with his pre-war experience as a shipyard welder, allowed him to implement solutions that weren't found in any damage control manual. As the patch held and the pumps began to gain ground against the flooding, Keith ordered his team to reinforce the repair with additional bracing. They weren't out of danger yet. The patch was temporary and would need to be properly repaired once they reached a safe port. But for the moment, They had stopped the KIDD from joining the growing list of ships claimed by the waters off Okinawa. On the bridge, Commander Bush received the news with visible relief. "Damage control reports the flooding is contained, sir," the messenger announced. "Chief Keith says we're not going to sink today." Bush allowed himself a brief smile before turning to the next crisis. With one boiler room destroyed, the KIDD's speed and maneuverability were severely compromised. They were still in dangerous waters, vulnerable to additional attacks, and needed to rejoin the task group as quickly as possible. "Set course for the task group," Bush ordered. "Best possible speed." As the wounded destroyer limped away from the picket station, her surviving crew continued the grim task of caring for the wounded and recovering the bodies of the dead. The final toll was devastating. 38 men killed and 55 wounded, nearly one-third of her total complement. But unlike so many other ships struck by kamikazes off Okinawa, the KIDD would live to fight another day. And in that survival lay a lesson that would reshape naval warfare for decades to come. The waters around Okinawa in the spring of 1945 had become a graveyard for warships. By the time the campaign ended in June, the United States Navy would lose more vessels than in any other battle of the Pacific War. Destroyers bore the brunt of these losses, with 17 Fletcher-class destroyers sunk or damaged beyond repair between March and July, most of them while serving on the radar picket stations. The kamikaze threat had revealed a fundamental vulnerability in naval warfare. Even the most heavily armed and armored warships could be crippled or sunk by a determined suicide attack. The Japanese had discovered that a single aircraft properly piloted could deliver a bomb with precision that no conventional attack could match. Yet amidst this carnage, certain patterns emerged. Ships with well-trained damage control teams and effective compartmentalization had significantly higher survival rates than those without. American destroyers, despite their relatively light construction, often displayed remarkable resilience when hit. The difference came down to three critical factors: design, training, and initiative. The USS KIDD's survival on April 11th highlighted all three elements. The Fletcher-class design, with its extensive compartmentalization and redundant systems, gave the ship a fighting chance. The intensive damage control training that had become standard throughout the U.S. Navy ensured that crews responded quickly and effectively to emergencies. And the initiative shown by men like Russell Keith allowed for innovative solutions that went beyond standard procedures. Contrast this with the fate of the Yamato just 4 days earlier. Despite her massive size and armor protection, the Japanese battleship lacked the comprehensive damage control systems of American vessels. Her crew, while brave and dedicated, had not received the same level of damage control training as their American counterparts. And the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Navy discouraged the kind of individual initiative that had saved the KIDD. When torpedoes struck the Yamato's port side, flooding multiple compartments, her damage control teams were quickly overwhelmed. As the ship began to list, her captain ordered counter-flooding of starboard compartments, a standard procedure, but one that reduced her overall reserve buoyancy to critical levels. Within 2 hours of the first attack, the mighty battleship had capsized and exploded, taking more than 3,000 sailors to the bottom. The KIDD, despite suffering catastrophic damage from the kamikaze strike, remained afloat thanks to the quick actions of her damage control teams. The innovative cofferdam technique employed by Russell Keith contained the flooding long enough for a proper patch to be welded in place. And unlike the Yamato, where damage control efforts were centralized and hierarchical, the KIDD benefited from multiple teams working simultaneously on different aspects of the emergency. After containing the flooding and fires, the KIDD steamed south to rejoin the task group. Her effective defensive fire drove off several more Japanese aircraft that attempted to finish her off. Upon reaching the fleet anchorage at Ulithi Atoll, she underwent temporary repairs before being sent back to the United States for comprehensive rebuilding. When we pulled into Ulithi, the sailors on other ships lined the rails to watch us come in, recalled Seaman Robert Collins. Our starboard side was a mess of patched steel and scorched paint, but we were still afloat. A chief on one of the repair ships shouted across the water, "What held you together?" Our chief shouted back, "Spit and stubbornness." In reality, it was much more than that. The KIDD had survived because of years of lessons learned the hard way, lessons about ship design, damage control procedures, and the vital importance of individual initiative in crisis situations. These lessons would be formally incorporated into naval architecture and training programs in the decades that followed, influencing warship design well into the modern era. Commander Fred Bush, who had assumed command of the KIDD just days before the kamikaze attack, recognized the symbolic importance of his ship's survival. While at Ulithi, he made good on a promise to his crew. The pirate emblem that had been ordered painted over in late 1944 was restored to the destroyer's number 1 stack, a visible symbol of the ship's indomitable spirit. For Russell Keith and the men of the damage control teams, the KIDD's survival represented a personal triumph against overwhelming odds. They had faced the same destructive force that had sunk the mightiest battleship ever built, and they had prevailed through skill, training, and improvisation. "I never thought of it as heroic," Keith would later say when interviewed about his actions. "It was just the job. The ship gets hit, you patch her up. That's what shipfitters do." This modest assessment belied the extraordinary nature of what Keith and his team had accomplished. In saving the KIDD, they had demonstrated the vital importance of damage control in modern naval warfare, a lesson that would save countless lives in future conflicts. The story of the KIDD's survival gradually spread throughout the fleet, becoming something of a legend among destroyer sailors. Naval engineers studied the innovative techniques used to contain the flooding, incorporating these lessons into training programs for future damage control specialists. The cofferdam approach pioneered by Keith would later be adopted as a standard emergency procedure for hull breaches in certain situations. When the KIDD returned to San Francisco's Hunters Point Naval Shipyard on May 25, 1945, she underwent extensive repairs and upgrades. The damaged boiler room was completely rebuilt, and her anti-aircraft armament was enhanced as part of the ongoing effort to improve destroyer survivability against kamikaze attacks. By August 1945, the KIDD was ready to return to action. She was en route to Japan for the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands when news arrived of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Days later, the Japanese surrender brought World War II to an end. The KIDD had survived the most destructive naval conflict in history, a testament to the resilience of her design and the skill of her crew. In the aftermath of the war, naval strategists and engineers carefully studied the experiences of ships like the KIDD and the Yamato. The conclusions were clear. The age of the battleship had passed, and future naval combat would be dominated by aircraft carriers and their escorts. Moreover, in this new era, survivability would depend less on armor thickness and more on effective damage control systems and training. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships conducted extensive analyses of kamikaze damage to destroyers, identifying critical vulnerabilities and developing countermeasures. The lessons learned from ships like the KIDD directly influenced the design of post-war destroyer classes with increased emphasis on compartmentalization, firefighting systems, and structural integrity. Perhaps the most significant legacy was in the area of damage control training. The experiences of World War II validated the American approach of comprehensive training for all sailors, not just specialized teams. This philosophy, coupled with the decentralized authority that allowed men like Russell Keith to take immediate action in emergencies, would become a cornerstone of U.S. Navy doctrine. The KIDD herself would go on to serve in the Korean War, earning an additional 4 battle stars before being decommissioned in 1964. In 1982, she found a permanent home in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, as a museum ship. Unlike other preserved Fletcher-class destroyers, the KIDD was restored to her 1945 configuration, providing visitors with an authentic glimpse of a World War II destroyer. Russell Keith returned to Bath Iron Works after the war, where he helped design improved damage control systems for new classes of destroyers. His innovations, born from the desperate fight to save the KIDD off Okinawa, would help protect a new generation of sailors facing the challenges of the Cold War era. The contrasting fates of the USS KIDD and the Yamato in April 1945 illustrated a profound truth about naval warfare: that survival often depends not on size or firepower, but on the ability to absorb damage and continue fighting. The Yamato, for all her massive guns and armor, proved vulnerable to the humble torpedo when her damage control systems failed. The KIDD, despite her relatively light construction, survived a devastating kamikaze hit through the skill and initiative of her crew. In this contrast lies the essence of modern naval design philosophy: that resilience matters more than raw strength, and that a ship's greatest defense is often the training and resourcefulness of the sailors who serve aboard her. Today, visitors to the USS KIDD Veterans Museum in Baton Rouge can still see evidence of the kamikaze damage that nearly sank her in 1945. A brass plaque on the quarterdeck commemorates the 38 sailors who lost their lives that day. And on the number 1 stack, the pirate emblem still proudly proclaims her nickname, the Pirate of the Pacific, a destroyer that refused to sink. The waters off Okinawa have long since washed clean of the blood and oil that marked the savage battle fought there. The Yamato rests on the seabed, a silent monument to a naval era that ended with her death. But the lessons learned from those desperate days continue to influence naval architecture and training to this day. In the end, what saved the KIDD when the Yamato was lost was not luck or providence, but the culmination of years of hard-won knowledge about how ships survive in combat. It was the innovative spirit of men like Russell Keith who saw not an insurmountable catastrophe, but a problem to be solved with the tools and skills at hand. It was the resilience built into the Fletcher-class design by engineers who understood that in naval warfare, the ability to take a hit and keep fighting often matters more than the ability to deliver one. And perhaps most importantly, it was the American naval doctrine that empowered every sailor, from the commanding officer to the lowest seaman, to take initiative in defending their ship. When the kamikaze struck and water began pouring in, there was no waiting for orders from above, no rigid adherence to protocols ill-suited to the specific emergency. There was only the urgent knowledge that the sea is an implacable enemy and that survival demanded immediate action. In those critical minutes after the kamikaze struck, when the difference between survival and sinking hung in the balance, the men of the USS KIDD demonstrated the truth that would reshape naval warfare for generations to come, that in the chaos of battle, it is not always the biggest ship that survives, but the one whose crew is best prepared to face the unexpected. The legacy of their actions lives on, not just in the preserved hull of the KIDD or in naval damage control manuals, but in the fundamental philosophy that guides the design and operation of warships around the world. It is a legacy written not in grand proclamations or strategic theories, but in the practical reality of what keeps a ship afloat when disaster strikes. Would you have broken the rules to save your ship and your shipmates? Would you have had the courage to innovate when standard procedures failed? The men of the USS KIDD faced these questions not as hypothetical exercises, but as life-or-death decisions made amidst fire, flooding, and chaos. Their answers saved a destroyer and changed naval history. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most profound acts of heroism occur not in charging enemy positions or engaging in spectacular feats of arms, but in the quiet, desperate struggle to keep a damaged ship afloat for just a few more minutes, long enough for skilled hands to work their magic against the relentless press of the sea. Share this story so others will remember what courage really means, not just in facing the enemy, but in facing disaster with nothing but skill, determination, and the unshakable will to survive.